This is Whisper from History, where forgotten voices rise again. The 1933 deal between Hitler and the Vatican was not just a piece of paper. It was a turning point in history. Slowly, its consequences began to unfold. Europe was moving towards war, and within that war, even darker secrets were buried. Stay with us till the very end. When war erupted in 1939 and Cardinal Pacelli became Pope Pius XII, the world waited to hear Rome's voice. But instead of thunder, there was silence. What few knew at the time was that Hitler had already sent his own blood relative, Prince Philipp von Hessen, to the Vatican, carrying a message from the Führer himself. The Vatican has always been a place of silence and spectacle, where incense rises as prayers blend with power. Yet, in the 1930s, beneath its gilded ceilings, another kind of incense lingered, the smoke of politics, fear, and compromise. The world's oldest spiritual authority found itself facing the most brutal modern regime Europe had ever known, and history would record their quiet agreement in the shadows. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in January 1933, the Catholic Church in Germany was not a marginal force. Catholics made up about a third of the population, and their political arm, the Center Party, had long been a balancing force in Weimar democracy. Priests preached to crowded parishes. Catholic schools taught millions of children. Monasteries dotted the countryside. For the Nazis, whose creed demanded total loyalty to the Führer, this parallel authority was a threat. Yet Hitler also understood the power of legitimacy. If the Vatican, the spiritual heart of over 400 million Catholics worldwide, recognized his rule, it would send a signal across the globe that his regime could not be dismissed as barbaric thuggery. He wanted respectability, and he found it in Rome. Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, then the Vatican Secretary of State, was the Church's chief diplomat. He had spent years in Germany as papal nuncio, carefully watching the rise of nationalism and Bolshevism. Pacelli believed, above all, that communism was the greater threat, atheistic, anti-clerical, intent on destroying religion at its roots. When faced with the choice of negotiating with the Nazis or seeing Catholic institutions dismantled, he sought an accord. The Reichskonkordat was born out of this calculation. To German Catholics, the treaty was both relief and betrayal. Priests were promised freedom to preach. Bishops could still ordain. Catholic marriages were recognized by the state. Yet in return, clergy had to withdraw entirely from politics, ending the Center Party. Overnight, millions of Catholic voters lost their political shield, clearing the path for Hitler's one-party dictatorship. Franz von Papen, the aristocratic Catholic politician who signed for Germany, bragged that the treaty was the greatest moral achievement of my life. In reality, it was Hitler's greatest propaganda victory of 1933. The world saw photographs of Vatican officials shaking hands with Nazi leaders, and headlines proclaimed harmony between cross and swastika. Few noticed that within months, Hitler violated the very terms, shutting down Catholic youth groups, arresting priests, confiscating publications. The Vatican protested, but weakly. The Pope had bound himself to the letter of the treaty, and Hitler had already pocketed its value. As the 1930s turned into the 1940s, the relationship deepened in secrecy. When Pacelli became Pope Pius XII in 1939, just months before the outbreak of war, the question was not whether to maintain the Concordat, but how far to extend its silent logic. Hitler himself despised Christianity in private, calling it a meek slave morality. But he knew the German people would not follow him if he directly declared war on the churches. He needed to neutralize the Vatican, to keep its voice muted. So back channels were opened. Newly uncovered Vatican archives reveal extraordinary scenes. In 1939 and 1940, Hitler's relative, Prince Philipp von Hessen, traveled to Rome to carry messages between the Führer and the Pope. Behind locked doors, in chambers lit by candelabra, discussions took place about church schools, seized monasteries, and the Jewish question. Pius XII, according to documents, pressed for an end to Nazi attacks on Catholic institutions. In return, he offered what Hitler most desired, assurance that the Vatican would not publicly denounce the racial policies of the Reich. It was not formalized in a treaty, but the understanding was clear. The Vatican would speak softly, sometimes not at all, and the regime would loosen its grip on Catholic life in Germany. This was the secret deal, unwritten yet binding in its consequences. It was a bargain that traded silence for survival. For many Catholics, especially in occupied countries, the price was unbearable. Imagine Warsaw in 1940, where Jewish families were forced into ghettos, while Catholic priests watched helplessly. The church could speak with the thunder of the pulpit, but instead, it spoke in whispers. In Germany, brave priests like Bernhard Lichtenberg of Berlin dared to pray publicly for Jews and were arrested, dying on their way to Dachau. Bishops like Clemens August von Galen of Munster condemned euthanasia programs, but were instructed not to mention Jews from the pulpit. Silence was strategic, but silence also cost lives. In the United States, the Vatican's stance was followed with unease. Catholic immigrants, many only a generation removed from suspicion and discrimination, found themselves torn between loyalty to Rome and loyalty to democratic ideals. American newspapers reported on Nazi atrocities, yet the Vatican's voice was muted. Jewish leaders pleaded for an open PayPal denunciation. Instead, Pius XII issued cautious statements about innocent people suffering, never naming Jews explicitly, never mentioning Auschwitz or Treblinka. To many in the American Jewish community, this was betrayal. Yet in the shadows, there were acts of courage. Convents in Italy opened their doors to Jewish families. Monks forged baptismal records to disguise identities. In Hungary, the papal nuncio, Angelo Rota, issued protective papers and saved thousands. In Rome, priests guided Jewish children into catacombs and church basements as Nazi trucks prowled the streets. Scholars estimate that Vatican networks helped save tens of thousands of Jews across Europe. These deeds, though heroic, were obscured by the larger silence. The paradox was unbearable. A church risking much in secret, yet refusing to risk its moral voice in public. Why did Pius XII remain so cautious? His defenders argue that one public outcry could have triggered Nazi retaliation against Catholics across Europe. Already, priests filled Dachau by the thousands. Bishops were under surveillance. Monasteries were seized. The Pope believed his words could make things worse, not better. His critics argue that silence, however tactical, became complicity. By refusing to name the crime, he allowed the criminals to act with less fear of moral condemnation. The question echoes painfully: what is the responsibility of moral authority in the face of extermination? For some, survival of the Church as an institution was paramount. For others, the duty to speak truth outweighed all risk. History offers no easy answer, only the haunting testimony of those who lived and died within that silence. After the war, as the world reckoned with the Holocaust, the Vatican sought to frame its actions as prudence, not indifference. Pius XII defended his record, saying he had acted through quiet diplomacy, saving more lives than loud protests ever could. Yet survivors and historians debated the cost of his silence. Some Jewish leaders thanked him for hidden aid. Others condemned him for his failure to denounce genocide. The Reich's Concordat, remarkably, was never formally revoked. It remains technically in force between the Vatican and Germany even today, a relic of one of history's most troubling bargains. For Americans, the story of this secret deal forces reflection on the meaning of moral courage. In a land that prizes free speech, the The Vatican's silence feels alien, even cowardly. Yet it also raises questions of realpolitik. How does one lead when every word might cost thousands of lives? Would a fiery papal denunciation have slowed the Holocaust? Or would it have led to more priests hanged, more convents burned, more Jews hunted down? History cannot replay itself to give us answers. It only leaves us with shadows and echoes. Inside the Vatican archives, opened only in recent years, dusty files reveal handwritten notes, reports from envoys, desperate pleas from bishops in occupied Poland, Hungary, Slovakia. They reveal the tightrope Pius XII walks, sometimes intervening to save a few hundred, sometimes declining to risk the wrath of Hitler's machine. The deal was not a single moment, but a continuous balancing act. A secret understanding renewed with every decision to speak or to remain silent. In the end, the Vatican endured. The Church survived, but its moral authority was scarred. For the Jewish people, the silence of Rome during their darkest hour remains a wound. For Catholics, the memory is a burden of conscience. And for historians, the story of this secret deal remains one of the most haunting case studies in the tension between faith, politics, and survival. This was not just a political pact. It was humanity's silence. But the question remains, why was this deal made? Was the Vatican's silence an act of survival, or a deeper friendship? Perhaps the answer still lies behind the locked doors of the Vatican. If you want us to take this story into part 3, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe and be part of our Dark History playlist. Because for me, this story is not just history. It feels alive, and I want you to feel it too. This was the Vatican's secret deal with Hitler, part of our Dark History collection. But the shadows don't end here. In this playlist, you'll uncover more untold stories, cyclically chilling, equally unforgettable. So keep watching the Dark History playlist, and subscribe to Whisper from History, where every whisper reveals a shadow the past tried to hide. This video is narrated by an AI voice. Script and editing done by human.